Hello and welcome to this week's Euranet Plus debate. During the coronavirus lockdown, we're talking to politicians, journalists, and citizens about the coronavirus crisis. And this week, we're going to be talking about the economic response. I'm Dave Keating, and today I'm joined by two MEPs. With me today are Spanish MEP Jonas Fernandez. He's from the center-left S&D group, and Finnish MEP Petra Sarvamaa from the center-right EPP group. Thank you both gentlemen for joining us today. Now our conversation today is coming at a really pivotal moment for this economic response because we're actually between two crisis meetings of the Eurogroup. That's the finance ministers of the countries that use the euro. After 16 hours of negotiations, yesterday morning, the Eurogroup broke up without a result. Eurogroup chief Mario Centeno has called them back this evening to resume talks, and they're trying to find an agreement on a combined EU united response to the economic crisis that's expected to be caused by the coronavirus. There's four possible measures on the table. Two are not controversial. That's a 100 billion euro unemployment reinsurance plan and a 200 billion euro loans from the European Investment Bank. A third, drawing credit from the 410 billion European Stability Mechanism, is more controversial because a lot of countries don't want that to come with conditions like it did during the financial crisis, but the Netherlands and Austria say it should still come with conditions. The most controversial measure being discussed, though, is the pooling of debt, these so-called corona bonds, designed to allow countries hardest hit by the crisis to borrow from international markets more cheaply and not risk a return to the sovereign debt crisis that we saw years ago. So we're going to talk about the different options on the table and talk about how Europe is going to recover. Let's first talk about the scale of the problem. Jonas, let's start with you because Spain, along with Italy, is of course the hardest hit by coronavirus at the moment. And we're probably going to see the country's very strict lockdown measures continued for a while. What kind of effect is this crisis going to have on the Spanish economy?
No, of course, at this moment, and first, good morning, it's very difficult to evaluate what will be the last result of the GDP during this year. Yesterday, we knew that French GDP went down around 6% in the first quarter. So honestly, I think that in Spain will not be better. So maybe the reduction of the GDP will be around 10% during this year. But this is an average maybe in the Eurozone. So it's true that now Spain and Italy are suffering more, the sanitary emergency, but I am sure, or maybe, no, the coronavirus will spread around European Union as a whole. So more or less, the reduction of the GDP will be around 10% on average in Eurozone.
Is quite a lot, and we heard other countries as well are going to be facing big problems. The French finance minister Bruno Le Maire said this could be the deepest recession in France since the Second World War. Petri, your part of Europe has been less hit at this point by the coronavirus in terms of number of cases, but of course these countries are also in lockdown, and that will have an economic effect. What kind of economic effect are you expecting in your country?
Well, hello to everyone. First of all, good morning. And we are here in Finland. We are talking about GDP reduction anywhere between 5 to even 13% at the worst scenario. So it will be around the same figures that Jose was mentioning there. So very, very grave indeed. But of course, we have to remember that the eventual, at the end of the day, numbers will be directly dependent on the duration of the lockdown and the stoppage of the economy. So we just don't know at the moment. I mean, it could be, it still could be in the best possible scenario, something resemblant of a V shape, very short-term recession that would then be able to bounce back rather speedily, but that remains to be seen. So it will be very, very grave.
And as you say, so much is going to depend on how long these lockdowns are. A lot of people have noted every day that the lockdown goes on, the economy suffers more. But of course, if you end the lockdowns too early, it could really cause a devastating health impact, which also wouldn't be helpful for the economy. What do you guys think is the best type of European response? Because in the imposition of the lockdowns, we really saw very national decisions being taken. Now the Commission is trying to have a coordinated EU response for exiting the lockdown, but we're seeing countries get very nervous about the Commission coming out with that, particularly this week before the Easter weekend. They asked the Commission not to come out with that yesterday because they're afraid it sends the wrong signal. Where do you think the national versus European response, where should that balance lie? Jonas, in terms of Spain exiting its lockdown, do you think that it's important for the instructions to come from the top down, from the EU to coordinate everyone else, or should national governments just go ahead with their own national plans for exits?
No, I think that when we entered in the lockdown, the decisions were completely decentralized in member states. We saw how the Schengen area started to block from one country to another country. So I think that we need some kind of planification in the process to accede to the lockdown, because even if there are some countries which could be able to finish the lockdown before, at the end of the day, the supply channels will be interlinked in any way. So even from the economic point of view, if only one country's exit before than others, the economic effect, the negative economic effect of this process to exit of the lockdown will be there. So I think that the Commission will try to reorganize or to organize, or at least to agree among member states how is the best way to go out from the lockdown, because otherwise we can see negative economic effects of this decentralized process in a way.
Do you think now is a good time to come out with that guidance, or should the Commission wait?
I think that maybe sanitarians can answer better to this question. Yeah, in my case, as economics, from my professional background, or as an MEP now, I cannot say if we can start now or maybe 2 weeks more. It's very difficult to say something with some coherence from my part at this moment.
Petri, some countries, Austria, Denmark, Czech Republic, have already come out with national exit plans, which has irked the Commission because they haven't come out with their guidance yet. Do you think it's okay for countries to be going ahead with national exit plans before that Commission guidance has been adopted?
Yeah, well, this is that's a good question, because this is a multidimensional thing, a monster, if you will, that we are dealing with. Now, first of all, let me just say this. The bottom line is that we are all in this together. I mean, eventually, no matter who comes out first, just like Jose said, you know, it's funny because before the corona pandemic, we always talked about how, you know, the global economy is totally interdependent. And of course, the European economy is totally independent. So I cannot see how, you know, because we are all in this together, we all cannot come out of this, you know, one before the other, if that's what you mean. Because even if, you know, any given member state successfully executes the exit plan and strategy. So, I mean, if the ships are not coming to its harbor, if the goods are not coming to its factories, if the, you know, if the workers are not coming to pick up the harvest from our fields, etc., then it's not, you know, it's not going to end. So we really need to have a coordinated response. But of course, for this pandemic, it's too late. And let's face it, I mean, what we now have to think about and start to plan immediately as we speak is for the next for the next pandemic, whenever that is going to be, whether it's going to be already hitting next year or in another 10 years. So that's what we have to do on the European level. But now I think we should be talking about more about the acute, immediate needs and the economic response that we, as you know, the EU and the European economy need, also globally speaking, in order to be as strong as possible coming out of this.
Well, as regards that economic response, let's talk a little bit about what the Eurogroup has on the table right now. Jonas, your Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez says that these Corona bonds would be a good way to guarantee the debt for the countries hardest hit so that we don't get a return to the sovereign debt crisis. Do you agree that this pooling of debt will be an important element for the economic recovery and is really essential? And if so, is it worth all of the disagreement that it's causing in the Eurogroup and maybe sidetracking other economic responses?
Yeah, no, I think that common debt in some way will have to be on the table of the negotiation. And the reason is clear. When the sanitarian crisis will be over, public debt in some countries will be very, very high. Yeah, for example, in Italy, the national public debt could be around 160% of its GDP. So with this level of public debt, there will be completely impossible to help our economies during the recovery. And we will need any kind of common action to set up the European economy again. Yeah, so and this is the reason by which my prime minister or my political group in the parliament are asking for some kind of common debt, because otherwise Spain, Portugal, or other countries will not be able to push their economy when the sanitarian crisis will be over. And I think that we will have to do this recovery together.
Petri, this idea for euro bonds was also discussed during the financial crisis a decade ago, and Finland wasn't a fan of the idea then. Do you think the situation is different now? Is this pooling of debt something that you think could be considered?
Well, I would not be as hasty as to jump from one end to the other. But having said that, I think that what we really have to be careful this time around is just simply that, you know, that the scale could become so huge that we at some point we have to be able to think outside the old box. I can go this far, but then again, the problem, of course, is when exactly do we define the moment? When do we think that the scale is so huge that we have to start pooling all together? I don't think we are there yet at this moment. But I also want to say that I personally think that it would be a mistake for us all if we would just stick to our old beliefs and old economic thinking too much. You know, the only reference point I think in the history to this is the Great Recession in the United States, the turn of the 20s and 30s, and the first years of the 30s. And if you think what they did, I mean, it was already by far the biggest laboratory of market economy and capitalism back in the day. And yet, I mean, they had people dying of hunger, you know, and they had massive unemployment. So they had to come up with something that clearly was out of their box back then. So this is a vague, you know, a thin line going back to history. but I think that we have to be very careful to understand that if this gets, to the worst case scenarios, then we also need unorthodox economic measures, and it might be, if we look globally, and then of course so much depends on how well the United States is going to come out of this. How China, we don't even know actually what the situation in China was and what it still may be. So there are too many question marks in this big equation. But yes, we have to be ready to start thinking in new terms.
And in terms of thinking in new terms, do you think that should include removing conditionality from accessing ESM funds?
At this point, not altogether, no. But I mean, but then again, if I understand correctly, Germany is trying to come up with a new interpretation of what all this could then concretely mean, and I think it's very important now politically to not just give a picture, but actually to exercise this in a way that no European Union member state feels is abandoning, and putting them in a different box as far as coming out of the corona economic pandemic, if you will. So this is very important. So we have to be, like I said, we're all in this together.
Well, we'll see what happens with the Eurogroup in the coming days. I'm afraid that's all the time we have for today's debate. I want to thank our two MEPs very much for joining us this week. Thank you, gentlemen, and we'll see what happens in the coming days.
Thank you, Dave.
Bye, thank you.